So, as most of you know, that the nervous system is composed of central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. And simply, the central nervous system is composed of the brain, the spinal cord. Anything outside the brain and the spinal cord is considered the peripheral nervous system, which is mainly composed of the nerves. And nerves are a collection of axons outside the central nervous system. They can come out of the spinal cord, so we call them spinal nerves, or from the cranial, so we call them cranial nerves. Whereas the collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system are called ganglia. Also, we have the sensory receptors that detect changes in the environment. For most of us, when we think of a nervous system, we think of a control system. And so, if you want to be a control system, you need to know and be aware of the changes in the environment, detect these changes, then process this new information from these changes, and then act accordingly for the appropriate actions. And that summarizes the functions of the nervous system. So the first thing is to detect changes in the environment, whether it's the external or the internal environment, through specific structure called sensory receptors. And this carry this information to the central nervous system to process them. So the first function of the nervous system is the sensory function, detecting changes in the environment and send it up to the central nervous system. Now, the second function is the integrative function, which means processing this sensory information, analyzing this information, and compare it to the previous information stored in the brain and the spinal cord, the central nervous system, to make decisions for appropriate responses. Now, the decision will be one of three things. Either will be discarded, this sensory information considered unimportant, and this is the majority of the decisions about sensory information, more than 90%. Or it can be considered important, so it has to have an immediate motor action. Or the CNS decided to store it for later use. So that will be stored as a memory in different areas of the central nervous system, mostly the cerebral cortex, to be used later for analysis and comparisons of other information. Again, this is an illustration of the central nervous system, the different parts of it, which is peculiar about the central nervous system, that each part has different specific function. Although the functional units in all of them is the neuron, which acts through action potential, but they have different functions, whether we're talking about the spinal cord or the medulla, which has, for example, the respiratory center and the cardiovascular center, which control this heart rate, contractility of the heart, breathing rate and rhythm. This area is called the cerebellum. It's important for learning motor skill, for coordination. If we're talking about this area, this is specifically for sensory information, somatic sensation. However, this area is for motor function. If we're talking about the specific area, it could be for visual information. So different areas in the central nervous system have different functions, although the functional unit is the same, which is a neuron. We're going to learn more about this during our lectures and when you are in the third year, inshallah. Now, the spinal cord, an important part of the central nervous system, it used to be thought that the only function of it is what we call it nerve impulse propagation, which means transmitting the information from the periphery to the brain and vice versa. That was considered the only function of the spinal cord. However, because it's part of the central nervous system, we said that the integrative function is a function of the central nervous system. So the spinal cord also can do an integration or a processing of information and making decisions about certain sensory information, which is clear during the spinal reflexes. This is part of the spinal reflexes in which the decision is made within the spinal cord. You can see here in the central nervous system that it has two parts. The darker one, we call it gray matter, and the lighter one, we call it white matter. And that's for a reason, because on autopsy it looks white because of the fatty material in the axons of the neurons, the myelin sheath. That's why it looks whitish. And when we say a white matter, so you expect that there is axons here. While the gray matter, cell bodies are here. So synapses, transmitting of information and processing of the information will take place within the gray matter. Now the brain can be also subdivided into lower brain, or what we call it subcortical region, and higher brain, or the cerebral cortex. So the processing of information in the subcortical regions that include the brainstem, cerebellum, diencephalon, basal nuclei, they process subconscious activities of our body. Like we talked about in the brainstem, there is the cardiovascular center and the respiratory center. So you regulate your breathing in a subconscious level. You're not consciously aware of these types of activities. Whereas processing of information in higher brain, or what we call the cerebral cortex, it includes perception or being consciously aware of these types of processes of this information. In addition, the cerebral cortex forms a major memory storehouse, and it's also important for a precise operation and the thinking process. Now comes the third function of the nervous system, which is the motor function. And the motor function, after we have the sensory information and then the decision about this sensory information, there is a decision that has to be executed through the effectors. And the effectors can be either muscles or glands. And the muscles can be smooth muscle, cardiac muscles, or skeletal muscles. The gland can be endocrine gland or exocrine gland. So these decisions will be held through the cranial and the spinal nerves to the effectors, which are the muscles and the gland, to perform certain function, to change the activity of this muscle contraction or the secretion of certain hormones or enzymes. Now, the peripheral nervous system is subdivided even into 3 subsystems according to the type of the effectors. So we can get sensory information, somatic sensory information, and process this information in the central nervous system, bring it back through the somatic motor neuron to the skeletal muscles. The skeletal muscles are the only effectors in the somatic nervous system. Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, the effectors are smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. So anything inside our bodies. And the motor function will be carried out through our autonomic motor neurons, which are divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Now, the third branch is the enteric nervous system, which was previously considered as part of the autonomic nervous system because, again, it's related to the internal organs in our body and more specifically the GI system. So it's considered for the smooth muscles, glands, and endocrine cells of the GI system. But as you see here, what's peculiar about the enteric nervous system and different from the autonomic, that sensory information does not come back through the enteric motor neurons from the CNS directly, but through the sympathetic and the parasympathetic neuron. In addition, there is what we call the brain gut that we don't understand yet very well, which is transmitting the information and making decisions between the enteric sensory neurons and then through motor neurons, enteric motor neurons, directly to the GI system without referring back to the central nervous system. Now let's have an example of the holistic function of the nervous system. For example, if you are holding the pen, you want to write your ID number on the exam paper. So holding the pen will activate certain sensory receptors, let's say pressure receptors. So pressure receptors are part of different types of receptors that are present in the skin and subcutaneous tissues to detect these changes in the environment, the mechanical changes that occurs, and that will activate this sensory receptors that's attached to a sensory neuron. This sensory neuron will carry this information in a specific pathway throughout the central nervous system from the sensory receptor to a specific area in the central nervous system. It's called the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex, through a pathway including series of sensory neurons until it reaches an area in the cerebral cortex where there is like a map of the body, a distorted map actually of the body, which you can see it does not represent the actual size of different organs in our body. So the largest size is for our fingers and lips and face, which makes sense if we are talking about somatic sensation or pressure and touch, the most important organs to recognize this specific sensory information should be in the hands and the face. Now the information will be processed in different areas of the cerebral cortex, including the somatosensory area, somatosensory association area, premotor area, until it reaches the decision to make certain motor function. So it goes to the primary motor area, which has like a map of the muscles in our body, and descend down through a descending pathway, which is a motor pathway composed of several motor neurons that synapse in specific areas and go through specific areas within the central nervous system to reach that muscle of the hand, so we can move this hand and write our ID number. So when we talk about sensation, what do we mean by this word? Sensation is a conscious or subconscious awareness of changes in the internal or the external environment. So when there is a change in blood pressure, that's a stimulus, that's a change in the internal environment. It will be detected by certain sensory receptors, we call them baroreceptors, and these changes will reach the central nervous system for certain decisions. So this is a subconscious awareness of these changes. We're not consciously aware of it, but it is a type of sensation. The processing usually in the subcortical areas or the lower brain areas. And when it reaches the cerebral cortex, like in the case of somatic sensation, pressure, touch, itching, tickling, that will be processed in the cerebral cortex and we will have the perception of it. So perception is a conscious interpretation of sensation, and it's usually the function of the cerebral cortex. What are the types of sensations or sensory modalities? We have different types of sensory modalities. We divide them into two general classes: the general senses and special senses. Special senses, there are 5 types: smell, taste, vision, hearing, and balance. Whereas the general senses, we subdivide them into somatic senses and visceral senses. These are coming from the internal organs in our body, and these are from the surface of our body and some deeper structures. These somatic sensations include tactile senses, which are touch, pressure, vibration, itch, and tickle. Thermal or temperature-related sensations can be warm or cold. Pain sensations and proprioceptive sensation, which detect changes in position and movement. The structures that detect these sensations, we call them sensory receptors, and they will be classified into different classifications according either to the microscopic structure, the location of the receptor, or the type of the stimulus detected. Now, based on the structure of the sensory receptors, it can be either part of the sensory neuron, we call it free nerve ending, like the pain receptor, or it can be encapsulated nerve ending, like the pressure receptor or Pacinian corpuscles, or it can be specialized separate cell that synapse or communicate with this first order sensory neuron, such as the taste receptor. And based on the location of the sensory receptors, they can be divided into exteroceptors, which are located near the external surface of the body, such as for vision, smell, temperature, and pain, or interoceptors that are located, or visceroceptors, in the internal organs of our body, or proprioceptors, which are located in muscles, tendons, joints, or inner ear, which give us an information about the body position and movement of the joints. Based on the type of the stimulus, we can divide sensory receptors into mechanoreceptors that detect changes in the mechanical changes in the structure and the function of the sensory receptor, such as in the inner ear, where the sensory receptors are hair cells. So these are specialized cells that have cilia of different length. We call them hair cells. On the tip of each cilia there is ion channels, and they will open or close according to the mechanical change or the direction of the movement of the cilia, whether it's toward the longest stereocilium or away of it, and that will cause different changes within this sensory receptor that will be detected by the sensory neuron. You're gonna take these details in 3rd year, inshallah. You don't have to remember the details in this picture. Thermoreceptors, we have different receptors for temperature, whether it's a cold temperature or a warm temperature within certain range to detect changes in the temperature. Nociceptor or pain receptors, these detect changes that happen at the tissue level. So any damage in the tissue level will be detected by these nociceptors, whether it's due to chemical factors or intense physical factors. So different factors can be detected by these nociceptors or pain receptors due to damage within the tissue. Electromagnetic receptor or photoreceptors that detect lights and they are present in the retina. This showing the photoreceptors, the rods within the retina in our eyes. This is in the resting state, no light. And this is when there is a light that will activate what we call it transretinal. It's vitamin A derivative that will result in a sequence of actions, events, signaling transduction pathways that leads to activation or inhibition of the sensory neurons. Chemoreceptors detect different changes in chemicals, and there are so many types of chemoreceptors, some for taste, some for smell, or some for the oxygen levels in our body. An example of the chemoreceptor is the olfaction or the smell sensation. Here is the odorant molecule or the molecule that you're gonna smell. It will bind to certain receptors on the cells, on the olfactory cells, and resulting in a signal transduction pathway and the sensory information reaching the central nervous system. So the term differential sensitivity of sensory receptors reflect that each type of sensory receptor is kind of specific or highly sensitive to certain stimulus, certain type of stimulus. For example, osmoreceptors cannot detect changes in sound, for example, or light, because they are created and they are designed to detect the changes in osmolality of the body fluids, not the sound waves. Now we said we have different types of sensory modalities. But how does the central nervous system know this type of modality or the other? How does it differentiate whether this sensation is pain and that is pressure, the other one is vision? It's because although all of these sensation will be transmitted through neurons, and neurons will be propagated these types of information to the central nervous system through action potential. So it's the same way, it's an electrical way of transmission, electrochemical. How does the central nervous system differentiate between different types or sensory modalities? The reason is because what we call it the labeled line principle. It's a specific pathway that takes this type of sensations from this specific sensory receptor into a specific area in the central nervous system. For example, if this pathway from the retina of the eye, it will go through a specific pathway until it terminates in the visual cortex or certain area in the occipital lobe. It's only for processing informations of vision. That's how the central nervous system interprets it as visual sensations. Whereas there is another area that's specific for audition or for hearing. All sensory receptors has a feature in common, which is whatever the type of stimulus that excites the receptors, the immediate effect is to change the membrane potential of this receptor through changing the movement of ions across the membrane, the permeability for these ions, and that will result in the formation of what we call it receptor potential. We'll continue about sensory receptors next lecture, inshallah. See you. Thank you.